Welcome to another coding video. In this video, I'm going to show you how to implement a Passkey login to your website. That is when you log into GitHub or PayPal or Amazon, and then it asks you to use your fingerprint or your biometric facial recognition to log in the next time you visit the website. So as always, I have an example here for you to show you what I'm talking about. Here's a sample implementation. First time, I log in using my email and password. Then I hit login. And when the login is successful, and before I get redirected to to wherever I'm going, it's going to ask me if I want to create a passkey to log in on this website. It's going to be available on all my devices. So even if I go to iPhone, I'm going to be able to use my passkey to log in on iPhone to this website. To create my passkey, I just log in using my fingerprint. And then it says passkey registered, and then you're logged in. Now, the next time you log in, you don't even have to do anything. As soon as you interact with the page like this, it's going to prompt you if you want to use your passkey to log in. And you just use your passkey to log in. Simple, right? Okay, we're going to go ahead and start implementing this. And I'm going to show you how to implement this with a website that doesn't have passkey login. So we're going to implement passkey into this basic login page. What you're going to need is to install this library. This is the library that you could use to enable passkey on your client side. Let me walk you through my code real quick. This is just a simple login component here. I got my fields here. After you enter your email and password and you hit login, this method gets called handle login. And inside handle login, I have a dummy login set up where I can just check if the email is correct like this, and then if it is, I say authentication successful. This is to emulate normal authentication in your website using email and password. Anyways, that's not the point. The point is after the authentication using the password and email is correct, you have to then generate the options for the passkey registration. And I do it here. I do it right before I redirect the customer or the user to whatever they're going. So in this method here, generate options, I'm going to have to call an endpoint that's going to take in the user ID, the username, and then generate the login options for them. For that, we need to go to the server side. This is my server endpoint code. Let me just organize things for you guys so you can see. Here, I'm going to use a similar library to the one that I showed you earlier, but for the server side, same name, simple WebAuthn/server. So you need to install this also on your server endpoint. This is the microservice that's going to generate the passkey options for my user. It's going to take in their user ID and then their username. And what you're going to do once you take those is that you're going to implement the generate register option method call within this library. This is the first method that we're going to implement here for this endpoint. This method is going to take your app name, your website name that's going to show up in the passkey prompt. If you're testing in localhost, here in RPID, you're going to have to put localhost. This is going to be replaced by your actual domain when you're deploying to production. So when you go to production here, this is going to be scriptpapi.com, but localhost when you're testing. And then you're going to take the user ID that you got from the client side and you're going to put it here, but as a buffer, not as a string. Username is going to go as a string as it is. Then here you got a bunch of options that I don't want to go into because it's going to bore you to death, and we're just trying to implement a basic use case here. But after this method is successful and options is created, you need to go ahead and store that in your database like this. I use Firebase for my database, and inside my Firebase database, there's a users collection, and I have a user document where my user information is stored. So inside there, I'm going to have my username registered, and I'm going to store the challenge string that gets returned from this method right here. So after you've done all of that, now you can return a response to the client side. You got to return the user ID, the username, and options to the client side. And as simple as that, we're done with our first endpoint. So let's go ahead and test this in Postman to see if it's working. All right, here's Postman, here's the endpoint. Let's try to test it. And this is what the response looks like. Now, this options object, which is full of a lot of different stuff, is what we're going to use to display the passkey registration option to the user. So you need that. Now let's go ahead and deploy this endpoint to production so we can use it in our client side. Now inside generated options, here's where all the actions take place. You're going to call that API that you're deploying to production. That's going to generate the options for you. You're going to pass it your user ID, username. I'm hard coding stuff for the demo's sake, but you shouldn't do that. Then you got to take the response that you get from that, the options object, this one, and then call this method from the client-side library start registration, and that's going to display that prompt to the user that asks him if he wants to register the passkey. So let's go and see if that is true. Log in. Login is correct. Here's the options. Perfect. Okay, cool. Once the user interacts, once the user finishes interacting with that prompt that asks them if they want to register the passkey, they're going to get an object here that comes out of this method. You need to take this object and send it to another endpoint that's going to be here. We call this endpoint verify registration. This endpoint is going to use this method, verify registration response. So again, in here, you're going to collect the user ID and you're going to collect the attestation response, which is the object returned here from this method. And then you need to do your due diligence and check if the user exists first and if they have the challenge string stored in their database, which we did store in the first API call here when they did the registration here. So here I'm again checking if this challenge exists in my database, and I take that value. Now I'm going to verify the registration. To verify the registration, you're going to use that method like this, verify registration response. Again, if you're using localhost, you put localhost here, and you put localhost here. User challenge goes here, and the object that you got from your client side goes here. And this will return verified, which is true or false. True if the registration was successful, false if it failed to register the passkey. But it'll also return some information that are very important that you need to store in your database so that when the user can log in the next time. And these are the information. First, I check if the user was verified correctly and if they have all the necessary registration information within their object to ensure that there's no error that happened. I'm gonna get their credential ID, which comes from here, their public key, which comes from here, the counter for how many times to log in. This prevents cyber attacks or whatever. And I'm going to take all of that, I'm going to store it in the database. But notice here, I don't just store it as it is because this is a buffer. I'd convert it to a buffer, and then I convert that buffer to base64 URL so I can store it in my database. I did the same thing with the public key here. The counter, I can store it as it is. Anyways, after you've done all of that, you can return the response of the verification to the user, and I just return it true or false like this to keep it simple. Now, to test this, we can't test it in Postman. I'd rather deploy this and test it in the client side. Okay, while that is deploying, I'm going to show you how to finish the step, the generate option steps in the client side. You're going to get this object, you're going to send it to your server like this, along with the user ID like this, and you're going to get the response from your server. And if it's true that the user was verified correctly and the passkey registered, then you're going to tell the user that the passkey has been registered or not. You just let them move in peace, which is what I do if they get an error. So if they get an error, I just don't say anything. I only tell them if the passkey was registered. You should probably display an error if there was an error though. Oh yeah, there's something I forgot to mention, which is here. Just now I had registration info, then ID, but actually it should be registration info, credential, .id, public key, and counter. So they're all inside credential, not registration info. So I fixed that and redeployed my endpoint, and now I'm gonna show you guys if the registration works. Hit login, and if the login is successful, it's gonna ask you to create a passkey. You say yes by giving them your fingerprint, your biometrics, whatever, and it's gonna start. It's gonna get the response from generate options, do start registration, which just happened, and then after that, it's gonna send it to this endpoint that we just created, and then that endpoint will confirm if the passkey was registered or not. And if we check our database, you can see the information was recorded in my user database. This is the counter, challenge, credential ID, and public key. These two are encoded as base64 URL. Now let's move on to the next section of this video, which is how to log in using the passkey. So what you gotta do in your client side is that you need to trigger the login option when the user interacts with something in the page. So for me, on my email field, this is the components from my email field. I have on focus. When the user clicks on this method gets triggered, generate login option. And this method is gonna call this next API, login challenge, which we're gonna implement. This is gonna get the login options for the user so we can display it to them. So we gotta go back to the server endpoint here, and we're gonna implement this method, generate authentication options, in here in login challenge. So let's do that. We're gonna need the user ID. For this API, we're just gonna need the user ID, which we're gonna use to get the user information, like the public key, like the credentials ID that we stored earlier in the previous API call. So we get the user ID, and we always want to check if the user exists, like this, and throw an error if he doesn't. You gotta generate the authentication options like this. Just call this method, put your domain, in my case, localhost, and then you're gonna get options. Now, options is gonna create a new challenge, just like we did in the first API in generate option here. This one has a challenge inside, which we need to store. So this challenge gets updated whenever we log in as well. So when that gets returned by this call, generate authentication options, you gotta store the challenge in there too, like this. Here I'm updating it in my database. And then that's it. And then that's it for this API. You gotta return a response to the client side and make sure to return the options object, just like we did with the Passkey registration. So let's go ahead and test this in the emulator to see if it works. Here it is, login. I'm only passing my user ID, send it, and this is what we get. We get options object, which we're gonna then use in our client side to prompt the user to use the passkey to log in. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and deploy that to production and use it in my client side now. Okay, back to the client side. And here inside generate login option, we're gonna call that API. And then I'm gonna now show you what happens when I call this API, pass it to the user, and then display the options to the user for login. All right, so we just interact with the page by focusing on the email field. This is gonna call the API. And then now now the prompt changed from saying do you want to create a passkey? It says you will be signed in to this website using your passkey. And then when you hit OK, it's gonna return this object, which we're gonna need to send to our server for the last step in this tutorial, which is verifying the login challenge. So now we got to move on to implementing the last API here, which is this one, verify login. And this API is going to use the last method in this library, which is verify authentication response. Now this API is going to receive two information, the user ID and the authentication response. Authentication response is what the client-side library here returns. So you got to pass that to your server along with the user ID. And then over here, just like before, you need to get the user challenge and confirm if the user exists, just to be safe. Throw an error if he doesn't. Then you're gonna need to get the credential information that we stored earlier on the server, like this. The counter, the credential ID, the credential public key. Remember, these two are encoded as base64 URL. Then you need to create a credentials object like this. This will have your credential ID. And as is, as a base64 encoded URL. But the public key, you're gonna need to convert that to a buffer from your base64 URL. And the counter goes as it is. Now you're gonna take that credential object and use it in your verify authentication response method. So here you're gonna put auth response that you received from the client side, the user challenge, again, your domain and your domain name and your credential, the object that you just created over here. And now this is gonna return the same an object that is very similar to the object that we had in the verify registration API call, which then you could use to return to the client side the response if the login was successful, and update your user document with the credential ID, the new credential ID, and the new counter for how many login attempts were there. Or if something goes wrong, you throw false. Okay, let's go ahead and test this out. Now let's go ahead and deploy this to production and use it on our client side. Now back to the client side. On the client side, you gotta take that auth response like we said earlier and pass it to your server endpoint along with the user ID. And then you're gonna take that response that you get from the server, and you're gonna check. So I'm returning in the response true or false. Returning true if the user is verified. So here I'm just checking if data is true, and if it is, then I'm gonna redirect the user to the next page where they're supposed to log into. If not, I'm gonna throw an error like this. Okay, simple enough. Now let's go and try logging in. Okay, let's test that out. Refresh, focus, and when I focus on the field, it's gonna prompt me to use my passkey to log in. I use my passkey to log in, and it's gonna send the result of the challenge to the server. The server is gonna confirm it, and then you're logged in. And that's it. That's how you use Passkey to log in to your web app. It's pretty simple enough. And that's all for today. I hope the video was useful. If you like the video, hit like, subscribe, or if you have any questions, just leave them in the comments below. If you want the full source code for that we used in this video, check the Patreon link in the description box below. You don't need that to implement this. You can just follow the video. But if you want to support the channel and get the source code in exchange, check out the Patreon link below. And see you next time. Bye bye.